There are things about my father that I never understood until I was 62 years old, standing in front of the storage unit he had been paying for in silence for 30 years. The padlock was rusted shut. The door was dented near the bottom where someone, sometime, had kicked it, and the small white envelope the manager handed me, with my name written across the front in my father's slanted, careful handwriting, was so light I thought it was empty. It wasn't empty. It just held something that didn't weigh much yet. My name is Hannah Wexler. I was born on a 160-acre wheat farm just outside Coldwater, in the flat northwestern corner of Kansas, where the wind never really stops and the sky takes up more of the world than the ground does. My father, Elias Wexler, worked that land for 54 years. My mother died when I was 9. My brother Garrett is 3 years younger than me and lives in a 6-bedroom house in Wichita with a circular driveway and a wife who has never once asked me how I'm doing. For 30 years, I believed my father had cut me out of his life on purpose. For 30 years, I believed he died believing I had betrayed him. I was wrong about both things. And the storage unit was where the truth had been waiting all along, behind a rusted padlock, in the kind of building people drive past every day without noticing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what was inside that unit, you need to understand the silence that came before it. You need to understand what it means to be the daughter who stayed, then left, then was told she could never come back. Most of all, you need to understand that the things a man hides for 30 years are not the things he doesn't care about. They are the things he cared about so much he could not bring himself to say them out loud. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I left the farm when I was 32. That part everyone in the family agrees on. What they disagree on is why. The story Garrett told, the one that became the official version, was that I abandoned our father after Mama died, that I took a teaching job in Topeka because I was too proud to keep working the land, that I broke our father's heart by choosing books over wheat and a city apartment over the home he built with his own hands. Garrett told that story so many times, at so many family dinners and after so many funerals, that even the cousins who knew better stopped correcting him. Eventually, I think Garrett began to believe it himself. The truth was quieter and more complicated, the way truths usually are. I didn't leave the farm because I wanted to. I left because I was offered a teaching position at a small high school in Topeka, 4 hours away, and my father told me to take it. He told me on a Tuesday evening in October, standing in the kitchen with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour before. He said, "Hannah, this land is going to take everything from you if you let it. Take the job. I can hold it together here." I argued. I cried. I told him I could teach at the elementary school in Coldwater and stay. He shook his head and said, "No, you go and you make something. The farm will still be here." And then he said the thing I held on to for the next 22 years, until I started to wonder if I had imagined it. He said, "I'd rather lose you to a city than to this dust." So I went. I taught English to 9th graders for 19 years. I came home every Christmas and every harvest. I called my father every Sunday at 4 in the afternoon. He would tell me about the rains or the lack of them, about the price of wheat, about whatever Garrett had managed to do or not do that week. I would tell him about my students. He would say, "Good girl," the way he had said it when I was small, and we would hang up and the week would start over. It worked in its own way for almost 2 decades. What changed it was Garrett. Garrett went to Wichita for college and never came back to the land in any meaningful way. He came back for funerals. He came back for the reading of our grandfather's will. He came back when there was paperwork to sign or money to be moved. By the time he was in his late 30s, he had a real estate license, a development partner named Trent Howard, and a habit of explaining to my father that the farm was an asset, not a way of life. I should have seen it coming. I think part of me did. But I trusted my father to hold his ground. He had held it against drought, against debt, against the death of his wife. I assumed he could hold it against the sun in a tailored shirt with a calculator. What I didn't understand, what no one understood, was that my father was already sick by then. The cancer in his pancreas had been growing for almost a year before anyone knew, and by the time it was diagnosed, he had maybe 6 months. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell Garrett. He told his lawyer, a man named Curt Boland, whose office was above the feed store in Coldwater. And he told no one else. He spent those 6 months making decisions he never explained. The first one I learned about was the deed. In the spring of his last year, my father transferred the entire farm, all 160 acres, the farmhouse, the barn, the equipment, the grain bins, every fence post and water right, into Garrett's name. Sole ownership, no reservation, no life estate, just a quick claim deed signed in front of a notary at the kitchen table, while I was 4 hours away grading sophomore essays on of mice and men. I didn't find out until after the funeral. Garrett didn't tell me himself. His wife, Marley, told me at the reception in the church basement in Coldwater, while I was holding a paper plate of ham and scalloped potatoes I couldn't bring myself to eat. She said it the way you'd mentioned the weather. Of course, the farm is Garrett's now. Your daddy made sure of that before he passed. I'm sure he had his reasons. I remember the fluorescent lights humming. I remember my cousin Della, May, looking at me from across the room with an expression I couldn't read. I remember setting the plate down on a folding table and walking out of the basement and standing in the parking lot for what must have been 20 minutes. Because by the time I came back inside, the casseroles had been cleared and people were starting to leave. I drove out to the farm that night, alone. The combine was still parked in the same place it had been parked since the harvest. The kitchen light was on, the way my father always left it on, even though my father wasn't there anymore. I walked through every room. I sat in his chair. I opened his closet, where his work coat still smelled like diesel and dust, and something underneath both of those that was just him. In the kitchen drawer, where it always kept the bills, I found a pile of open envelopes from a storage facility in Hayes, 2 counties over. The bills went back almost 30 years. He had been paying $24 a month, then 30, then 40 as the rates went up. 3 decades of small monthly payments for a unit I had never heard him mention. I held the envelopes for a long time. I thought about asking Garrett. I knew, even then, that I would not ask Garrett. The next morning, Garrett called me. He didn't say hello. He said, "Hannah, we need to talk about logistics. The farm is mine now, and I have plans for it. I think it's best if you don't come around for a while." I said, "What plans?" He said, "We're putting it up for development. Trent's already drawn up preliminary maps." I said, "Garrett, that land has been in our family for 92 years. He said, "And it'll be worth 9 times what it's worth as farmland once we subdivide. Be reasonable, Hannah. You haven't worked that land in 20 years. It's not yours to be sentimental about." I hung up. I packed a bag. I drove back to Topeka, and I did not return to Coldwater for 30 years. That is what shame does. It convinces you that silence is the same as dignity. It convinces you that staying away is the same as letting go. It is not the same. It never is. The years that came after my father died were the smallest years of my life. I taught. I retired at 60. I lived alone in the same 2-bedroom apartment I had moved into when I was 32, with the same view of the same parking lot. I kept a photograph of my father on the bookshelf, the one of him standing at the edge of the wheat field with his hat tipped back, and I would sometimes go a whole month without looking at it, because looking at it cost me something I didn't have anymore. Garrett did exactly what he said he would do. The farm was subdivided into 32 residential lots, then sold off in stages over the course of 15 years. The farmhouse was bulldozed in 2009. I read about it in the Coldwater paper, which I subscribed to for reasons I couldn't fully explain to myself. The barn lasted longer, until 2014. By the time I was 60, the only Wexler land left in Wexler hands was the family cemetery at the edge of what used to be the South 40, a small square of grass and old stone surrounded on all sides by cul-de-sacs with names like Meadowview Lane and Wheatfield Court. Garrett got rich. Not Wichita Mansion rich because of the farm alone, but the farm money was the seed for everything else, and the everything else multiplied. He bought a lake house. He bought a boat. He stopped calling me on my birthday somewhere around year 4, and I stopped calling him on it somewhere around year 6. And after a while, we were 2 people who shared a last name and nothing else. I told myself I was at peace with it. I was not at peace with it. I was just very, very tired. What changed was a phone call from a man named Curt Boland. It came on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, a few weeks after my 62nd birthday. The voice on the other end was old, careful, the kind of voice that had spent 50 years choosing its words. "Mrs. Wexler? Hannah Wexler? My name is Curt Boland. I was your father's attorney. I don't know if you remember me." I remembered him. He had been at the funeral. He had shaken my hand without saying anything, which I had taken as coldness at the time, and which I now suspect was something else entirely. He said, "Hannah, I'm calling because I'm closing my practice. I've been holding some materials of your father's for 30 years, on his instructions, and the time he specified for releasing them has now arrived. I'd like to forward them to you, but there's also a physical location I think you'll need to visit in person. Are you in a position to come to Kansas?" I said, "What materials?" He said, "I'd rather not go into on the phone. I can tell you that your father was very specific about how this was to be handled, and that the instructions were not to be carried out until 30 years after his passing. I have honored that. The 30 years was up last month." I said, 30 years? Why 30 years? There was a long pause. Then Curt Boland said, "Hannah, your father told me, and I'm quoting him as best I remember, that 30 years was about how long it would take for truth to outlast the people who had reasons to bury it." I sat down on the edge of my couch, and I did not say anything for a long time. Curt said gently, "He also told me to tell you, when this day came, that he was sorry. He said you'd know what for." I drove to Kansas the next morning. Curt Boland's office was exactly where I remembered it, above the feed store in Coldwater, up a narrow flight of wooden stairs that creaked the same way they had 30 years ago. Curt was thinner now, almost translucent, but his eyes were the same. He stood up when I came in and shook my hand the way he had at the funeral, and this time I understood what the silence had been. He had been carrying something for me. He had been carrying it for 30 years. He hadn't trusted his voice. He sat me down at his desk, and he opened a fireproof file cabinet behind him, and he pulled out a folder, so thick it had been bound with rubber bands. "Your father came to see me in May of 1994, Curt said. He had been diagnosed 3 weeks before. He had not told anyone. He sat in that chair you're sitting in now, and he told me what he wanted done." He set the folder on the desk between us. "Hannah, I want to be careful here. I want you to understand the order of things. Your father did 3 separate legal actions in the last 6 months of his life, and he did them in a very specific order, and the order matters." I said, "Tell me." Curt opened the folder. The first thing he did on May 14, 1994, was create an irrevocable trust. The trust was funded with a series of assets I'll describe in a moment. He named you, Hannah Wexler, as the sole beneficiary. He named me as trustee, with instructions that the trust was not to be disclosed to you or to anyone else for 30 years from the date of his death. I felt something inside my chest go very still. Curt continued. The second thing he did, 3 weeks later, was sign the quitclaim deed transferring the surface farm, the homestead, the equipment, and the visible operation of Wexler Farm to your brother Garrett. That is the document Garrett knows about. That is the document the family knows about. He paused. The third thing he did, Hannah, was the most important, and it's the thing I need you to understand before we go any further. Are you ready? I nodded. I wasn't ready. I nodded anyway. Curt said, "The farm your father transferred to Garrett, the 160 acres. Your brother received the surface rights to that land. Do you understand what surface rights are?" I said, "The right to farm it, to build on it, to sell the dirt." Correct. What he did not receive, Hannah, were the mineral rights. The mineral rights to the entire 160-acre parcel had been severed from the surface estate by your grandfather, Walter Wexler, in 1961. Your grandfather conveyed the mineral rights into a separate trust at that time, and your father inherited those mineral rights in 1978, when your grandfather died. He looked at me. In May of 1994, Hannah, your father transferred the mineral rights to that 160 acres into the irrevocable trust one just described, the trust of which you are the sole beneficiary. I said, "I don't understand." Curt said, "I know. Let me say it differently. Garrett owns the surface. He always has, since the day your father signed it over to him. He can build houses on it, and he did. He can sell lots, and he did, but the minerals, the oil and gas, and anything else of value beneath the soil, those have belonged to you since 1994. And Hannah, he leaned forward slightly. In 2011, an energy company began drilling on the parcel directly north of the old Wexler farm. They struck a productive horizontal play that runs under almost the entire former farm. The royalties have been accumulating in your trust since 2012. He turned the folder around so I could see the top page. It was a financial summary. I had never been good with numbers, but the figure at the bottom was not difficult to read. I said, "That's not real." Curt said, "It's real. It's been compounding for 13 years. There are monthly statements going back to the first royalty check. I have them all." I sat very still. I am not going to tell you the number on that page, because the number is not the point of this story. I will tell you that it was enough that I did not have to teach again, and enough that no one in my family would ever again be able to call me the daughter who left and got nothing for it. The number was the smallest part of what was in that folder. The largest part was a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, with my name on it in my father's handwriting. Curt said, "He told me to give you this last. He said you should read it before you go to the storage unit." I said, "What storage unit?" Curt said, "There's a unit in Hayes. He's been paying for it since 1994. The lease transferred to the trust on his death, and I've kept it current. The contents are yours. They've been yours for 30 years. You just didn't know." I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. My father's handwriting on the front. The same slant, the same careful pressure on every letter. I opened it in Curt's office, with Curt sitting across from me, because I did not trust myself to open alone. The letter was 3 pages long. It was written on lined paper torn from a notebook. I will not share all of it with you, because some of it belongs only to me, but I will share enough. It began, "Hannah, by the time you read this, I have been gone for 30 years, and I am sorry for every one of them." It continued, "I knew when I was diagnosed that Garrett would not let the farm stay a farm. I knew it because I had watched him for 10 years already, watched the way he looked at the land like it was math. I had 2 choices. I could fight him while I was dying, or I could let him have what he wanted and protect the part that mattered without telling anyone. I chose the second one. I am not sure it was the right choice. It was a choice I made. I gave Garrett the surface because the surface was what he wanted. He wanted to subdivide, and he wanted to sell, and he wanted to be a man with money in Wichita. I let him have it. I did not have the strength to stop him, and I did not want to spend my last 6 months in a fight. But the minerals are yours, Hannah. Your grandfather kept them separate for a reason. He used to tell me the surface is what you live on, but the minerals are what you leave behind. I always thought he was being dramatic. I learned otherwise. I have put them where Garrett cannot touch them. I have put them in your name, in a trust Curt will explain to you. If there's ever anything beneath that land, anything at all, it will come to you and not to him. I have one more thing to tell you, and it is the thing I should have told you the day Garrett told the family I had abandoned you. I did not abandon you. I sent you to teach because I wanted you to have a life that did not require you to lose your hands the way I lost mine. I told Garrett, when he was 26 and home for Christmas, and asking me about my will, that the farm would go to him because you had your own life. I did not tell him about the minerals because he did not ask, and because I was already starting to learn what kind of man he was going to be. He has probably told you a story about why I cut you off. He has probably told the family the same story. None of it is true. I never cut you off. I called you every Sunday until the week I went into the hospital. The Hannah he describes does not exist. She never did. I am sorry it took 30 years to clear your name. I am sorry I asked you to wait that long without knowing you were waiting. I needed Garrett to have spent everything he was going to spend, and I needed the truth to outlast his version of it. I am sorry. I am so sorry. The storage unit in Hayes has the rest. Curt will give you the key. Take your time. There is no hurry now. I love you. I have always loved you. The land knew it even when no one else did. Daddy, I read it twice. The second time I read out loud, very quietly, because I needed to hear my own voice say the words. Curt did not look at me. He looked at his hands, folded on the desk, and he gave me the dignity of not watching me cry. When I was done, he handed me a small brass key on a paper tag. The tag said Unit 47, Stockwell Storage, Hays, Kansas. I drove to Hays that afternoon. Stockwell Storage sat at the edge of town, off a frontage road, the kind of place you would never look at twice. The manager was a woman in her 30s named Reba, and when I told her my name, she nodded as though she had been expecting me for a long time. She handed me the white envelope with my name on it, the one I described at the beginning of the story. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper with one sentence in my father's hand. Everything in this room is what I could not say. That was all. She walked me down a long row of orange roll-up doors and stopped at number 47. The padlock was rusted shut. She had to use bolt cutters. The door rattled up on its tracks and the dust rolled out in a slow wave, and I stood on the threshold and looked at 30 years of my father's silence. It was not what I expected. I had expected, I don't know what, money maybe, documents, something legal and cold. I had already gotten the legal and cold part in Curt Boland's office. I was prepared for more of it. This was something else. The unit was the size of a one-car garage, and was full from the back wall to within 3 feet of the door. The first thing I saw was furniture. My mother's rocking chair, the one I remember from the front porch, wrapped in a sheet. The kitchen table from the farmhouse, the one I had eaten at every day until I was 32. 2 of the dining chairs. The sideboard that stood against the east wall of the dining room with my grandmother's blue plates inside it. The plates were inside it still, wrapped in newspaper, all 12 of them, including the one I had broken when I was 7, and that my father had glued back together, so carefully you almost couldn't see the seam. Behind the furniture, in clear plastic bins, were photographs, hundreds of them, boxes and boxes, pictures of my mother I had never seen, pictures of me as a child I had not known existed, my first day of school, my 8th birthday, a Polaroid of me and my father standing at the edge of the wheat field on the morning of my high school graduation, my cap in my hand, my father's hand on my shoulder, both of us squinting into the sun. There was a box of letters I had written him from college, every one of them kept in the order they had been received. There was a box of my old report cards, every one, from kindergarten through 12th grade. There was a quilt my mother had been making the year she died, unfinished, folded in tissue paper, with a note pinned to it in my father's writing that said for Hannah, "Your mother was making this for your wedding. I did not know if you would marry. I kept it for you anyway." There were my mother's wedding rings in a velvet box. A note, "These were always meant for you. Garrett's wife wanted them. I told her they had been lost. They were never lost. They were here." There was a stack of Sunday afternoon photographs, taken with a timer on my father's old camera, of my father sitting alone at the kitchen table with the phone, receiver pressed to his ear. Dozens of them, year after year. He had taken a picture of himself on the phone with me every single Sunday for almost 20 years, and he had labeled each one on the back with the date and the words Hannah called. Even the last one, 3 weeks before he went into the hospital, when his hands were shaking too hard to hold the camera steady. The picture was blurred. The date was right. I sat down on the cement floor of the storage unit, in the dust, and I cried the way I had not cried in 30 years. I cried for my father, who had loved me without being able to defend me. I cried for the version of myself that had spent 30 years believing I had been a disappointment. I cried for my mother, who had not lived long enough to see any of this. I cried for the wheat field that was a subdivision now, and for the girl who had stood at the edge of it on her graduation day, and for the man who had known, even then, that he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to leave her something the world could not take away. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. I stayed in Hays for a week. I rented a small room at a motel on the edge of town, and I drove out to the storage unit every morning at 8, and I went through it slowly, one box at a time. I did not rush. There was, as my father had said, no hurry now. In the bottom of the third bin of papers, beneath my report cards and an envelope of recipes in my mother's handwriting, I found something that changed the shape of what I was about to do. It was a manila folder labeled, in my father's hand, for Hannah, read after unit. Inside it were copies of every piece of correspondence between my father and Garrett during the last 6 months of his life. Letters, typed and signed. A few handwritten notes. A transcript of a phone conversation that my father had asked Curt Boland to take down on his behalf, because he said his memory was starting to slip and he wanted a record. In one of those letters, dated August of 1994, 2 months before my father died, Garrett had written, "Dad, I appreciate that you want to do right by Hannah, but the realistic situation is that she made her choice a long time ago. She left. She doesn't farm. She doesn't visit except at Christmas. Whatever sentimental notion you have about leaving her something tied to the land, I'd ask you to set aside. The farm needs to go to one person, cleanly, and you and I both know that person is me. I'm the one who's been here. I'm the one who's invested. Hannah has her teaching. Let her have her teaching." In the margin of that letter, in my father's handwriting, 3 words, "He doesn't know." In another letter, dated a month later, my father had written back, "Asterisk Garrett, the farm will be transferred to you on the terms we have discussed. Surface rights, the farmhouse, the equipment, the water rights, the grain bins, everything you can see. I am not arguing with you about this. You will have what you want. I would ask one thing of you, and you do not need to answer me now, but you should think about it. The farm has been in this family for 91 years. Your grandfather worked that land for 43 of them. I have worked it for 54. There's a way to be the man who inherits something, and there's a way to be the man who consumes it. I am asking you to be the first kind of man. I am not telling you. I am asking. If you cannot be the first kind of man, that is a thing I will have to live with. Or rather, it is a thing I will not have to live with, since I will not be here to see it. But I will know, in the time I have left, what kind of son I raised. Your father, asterisk." There was no reply to that letter in the folder. Garrett had not answered it. I sat in the storage unit with that folder on my lap for a long time. The dust drifted in the slatted light. Somewhere in the front office, Reba was playing a country station softly through a tinny speaker. I could hear the rumble of trucks on the frontage road. My father had given Garrett the chance to be a different kind of man. Garrett had not taken it. My father had known, by the end, exactly what kind of son he had raised, and he had done what he could. He had given Garrett the surface, and he had given me what was beneath. That was when I made my decision. I had not gone to Kansas with a plan. I had gone to Kansas to retrieve what was left for me. I had not been thinking about Garrett at all, except as a closed door I had stopped knocking on a long time ago. But there were things in that storage unit that did not belong only to me. The photographs of my mother, the quilt she had been making, my grandmother's blue plates, my mother's rings. There were things in there that belonged to my brother's children, my niece Lila and my nephew Drew, whom I had not seen since they were toddlers and who had grown up being told by their father that I was the aunt who had abandoned the family. I did not want revenge. I had spent 30 years discovering, slowly, that revenge is just a slower form of the same wound. I wanted something else. I wanted the truth to be in the room. I called Curt Boland. I said, "Curt, I need to know one thing. Has Garrett ever asked about the mineral rights? In all these years." Curt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Once, about 6 years ago, when the energy company was still in the leasing phase, he called me. He asked if I knew anything about a severance of mineral rights on the old farm. I told him I was retired from active matters related to your father's estate, and that any inquiry should go through the appropriate channels. He didn't press. He didn't press because he didn't think he needed to. He didn't press because he thought he already had everything. That was your father's bet. Hannah, that Garrett would be too sure of himself to look. Did my father say that? Your father said, and I am quoting him, 'A man who thinks he has won everything stops counting.' He said that in this office in 1994. I have thought about it many times since. I said, 'Curt, I want to do something. I want you to help me arrange it.' I told him what I wanted. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, 'Hannah, are you sure?' I said, 'I'm sure.' He said, 'All right, give me 3 weeks.' I drove back to Topeka with the trunk of my car full of photographs and the rocking chair strapped to the roof. I unpacked everything in my apartment. I set the rocking chair by the window. I hung one of the photographs of my mother above the bookshelf, next to one of my father at the wheat field. For the first time in 30 years, my apartment did not look like the place a person had been hiding. It looked like the place a person had been waiting. 3 weeks later, I drove back to Coldwater. The gathering was held at the old Grange Hall, because it was the largest space in town that I could rent on short notice, and because Curt Boland had once been the president of the Grange and could pull a string or two even at his age. We invited Garrett and his wife, Marley. We invited their children, Lila and Drew, who were both adults now, 28 and 25. We invited a dozen of the older Coldwater families, the ones who remember my father and my grandfather. We invited my cousin Della Mae, who had looked at me across the church basement 30 years ago with that expression I could not read at the time. I now know what that expression was. It was a woman trying to tell me, across a crowded room, that she did not believe Marley's version of the story. She had been waiting 30 years for someone to ask her. I had not asked her. I would, eventually, and we would both cry. But that came later. The Grange Hall had a small stage at one end, with a podium and a microphone. The chairs were folding metal, the kind that scrape when you stand up. The light came in through high windows that had not been washed since around the time the Grange started losing members. It smelled like coffee and old wood. It smelled, in some way I could not have explained, like my father. Garrett came late. He always came late. Marley was with him. In a cream-colored coat she did not take off. Lila came in separately, alone, and sat in the back. Drew did not come at all. Garrett looked the same as he had 30 years ago, only older and softer, with kind of tired weight around the eyes that comes from not being challenged for a long time. Curt Boland made the opening remarks. He stood at the podium, and he introduced himself the way he always did, which was without much fanfare. And he said, "Some of you knew Elias Wexler. Some of you knew him well. He left some matters with me 30 years ago that, by his instructions, are now to be made public. I will be brief. The rest will be Hannah's to say." He explained the trust. He explained the severance of mineral rights in 1961. He explained the transfer of those mineral rights into the trust in 1994. He read aloud the relevant portions of the deeds. He held up the documents. He named the energy company and the date the royalties had begun to accumulate. He did not name the figure. That was not for the room. I watched my brother's face the whole time. The first 30 seconds, he did not understand what was being said. The next 30 seconds, he understood, and he did not believe it. The minute after that, he believed it, and his face went white in a way I have not seen on a human face before or since. Marley put her hand on his arm. He did not seem to feel it. Lila, in the back, was leaning forward in her chair. Her hands were clasped in front of her mouth. She was looking at me, not at her father. Curt finished. He said, "I will turn it over to Hannah Wexler now. Some of you have not seen her in a long time. I would ask you to listen." I walked to the podium. My legs did not shake, although I had expected them to. I had thought, on the drive over, that I would be afraid. I was not afraid. I felt, in some way that surprised me, like my father was standing behind me. I spoke for about 20 minutes. I will not tell you everything I said. Some of it was for that room only, but I will tell you this. I told them my father had not abandoned me. I told them the version of the story they had heard. The version Marley had been telling at funerals and weddings for 3 decades was not true. I told them my father had called me every Sunday until 3 weeks before he died, and that he had taken a photograph of himself on the phone every one of those Sundays, and that I had those photographs in my car if anyone wanted to see them. I told them about the letter Garrett had written in August of 1994, the one asking my father to set aside any sentimental notion of leaving me something tied to the land. I read it aloud. I read my father's reply aloud. I read the part where my father had asked Garrett to be a different kind of man. I let the silence after that part be as long as it needed to be. I told them what was in the storage unit, the rocking chair, the plates, the quilt, the photographs. I told them my mother's rings had been kept from me, and that they had not been lost, and that I was wearing them, and I held up my hand. Marley did not look at my hand. Marley was looking at the floor. I told them I was not standing at the podium to take anything back. The farm was gone. The farmhouse was gone. The barn was gone. There was no one alive who could rebuild them, and I would not have asked. I said the things that had been done could not be undone, and I was not asking for them to be undone. I said, I am here because my father waited 30 years for the truth to outlast a lie, and I am not going to let the 30 years he waited be wasted. The lie ends in this room. Today, I looked at Garrett. Garrett was looking at his hands. I said, Garrett, I do not hate you. I have never hated you. I have spent 30 years not knowing what you knew and what you didn't, and I have decided today that it does not matter. Whatever you knew, you have lived your life. You have your house and your boat, and your wife and your 2 children. You did what you did with what Daddy gave you. The minerals were never yours to take, and they are not yours now, and I am keeping them. That is not a punishment. That is a fact. The fact has been true for 30 years. You just did not know it. I paused. I am asking you for one thing. One thing only. I want you to stand up in this room, in front of these people, and I want you to say out loud that I did not abandon our father. That is all. You do not have to apologize. You do not have to explain. You only have to say it, and then we are done. You can go back to Wichita and live your life, and I will go back to Topeka and live mine, and the truth will be in the room, and that will be enough. Garrett did not move for a long time. Marley whispered something to him. He did not answer her. He looked up at me, finally, and I saw, for the first time in my life, that my brother was an old man. He had aged when I wasn't looking. We both had. He stood up. The folding chair scraped. He said, in a voice that was not quite his own, Hannah did not abandon our father. She did not. I told that story. I told it a long time, and I told it because it was easier than the truth. I am sorry. He sat down. There was no applause. There should not have been applause. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Della Mae stood up in the 3rd row, and she walked over to me, and she put her arms around me, and she said into my hair, It took you long enough, you stubborn old goat. And I laughed, and then I cried, and then we both did, standing there at the edge of the stage in the old Grange Hall, while the dust drifted in the high windows. I went back to Topeka the next day. I did not see Garrett again for almost a year. He did not call. I did not call. I think we both needed the silence to settle into something other than what it had been. Lila called, though. Lila called the week after the Grange Hall, and we talked for 2 hours, and she came to visit me in Topeka the month after that. And we sat in my apartment with the photographs spread out on the coffee table, and she asked me about her grandmother. I gave her the quilt my mother had been making. I gave her one of the blue plates. She cried over the plate the way I had cried in the storage unit, and I knew then that something was being passed forward that I had not been able to pass forward before. Drew came around eventually too, though it took longer. Garrett wrote me a letter in the spring, a real letter on real paper, in his own handwriting. It was 4 pages long. I will not share it, because some letters are not for sharing. I will say that he asked me to forgive him. I will say that I wrote back. I will say that we are not what we were when we were children, and we will never be that. And we are also not what Marley made us into, and we are not what 30 years of silence made us into either. We are something newer and smaller and more honest. We are a brother and a sister who are still alive. That is more than I expected, and less than I once would have hoped for. It is what we have. The royalties continue to come in. I have set up the trust to fund a scholarship at the high school in Coldwater for any student who wants to study agriculture or earth science. I have set aside an amount for Lila and an amount for Drew in their names, to be released when they turn 40, the same age I was when I stopped expecting anything good to happen to me. I have donated the family cemetery and a small surrounding parcel to the Coldwater Historical Society, with instructions that it be maintained as a wildflower meadow, the way it was when my grandmother was a child. The cul-de-sacs surround it. There is nothing to be done about the cul-de-sacs. The meadow will be there anyway, in the middle of them, the way the truth was there in that storage unit all along. I drove back out to the old farm one more time, last summer. There's a development sign at the corner where the gravel road used to turn off. I parked my car, and I walked through the cul-de-sacs to the cemetery. The wildflowers had not been planted yet. The ground was just bare dirt and a few tufts of buffalo grass. I sat down on the ground next to my father's stone and my mother's stone and my grandfather's stone, and I told them what had happened. I told them the truth was in the room. I told them I had said his name out loud in front of people who needed to hear it. The wind moved across the bare ground. It carried dust the same way it had always carried dust, the way it would carry dust long after I was gone. I sat there until the sun was almost down. Then I drove back to Topeka, to my apartment with my mother's rocking chair by the window, and my father's photograph on the bookshelf, and my grandmother's blue plates in a cabinet I had bought specifically to hold them. I sat in the rocking chair until it got dark. I did not turn on the lights for a long time. I thought about my father at the kitchen table in May of 1994, sick and dying, and choosing to spend his last 6 months building something that no one would see for 30 years. I thought about how lonely that must have been. I thought about how he must have wondered, in those last months, whether I would ever know, whether I would ever forgive him for the silence required, whether 30 years would be enough of the truth to outlast a lie, or whether the lie would simply be the last word. It was enough. Just barely. It was enough. The land knew it, the way my father said it would. The land had been holding it the whole time, the way land does in the mineral and the dust and the deep water, in the things you cannot see from the surface, in the things that outlast every man who ever thought he owned them. There are things about my father that I never understood until I was 62 years old. I understand them now. I understand most of them now. The rest, the part one will never fully understand, is the part one carry. It is the part anyone carries who has loved someone who is gone. It is the part that is not for telling. The fields are still there under the houses. The wheat is gone, but the soil remembers being wheat. The grandfather is gone, and the father is gone, and the daughter who left and came back is 62 years old now. And the sun comes up over the eastern half of what used to be the farm, whether anyone is there to see it or not. That is the legacy, not the money, not the trust, not the Grange Hall and the truth in the room. The sun coming up, the land remembering, the daughter finally knowing, thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.